They say revenge is a dish best served cold. Mine was served from the 54th floor corner office at Sterling & Vance, my mentor's office. 3 months ago, in this very room, Richard Sterling himself told me I wasn't getting the promotion I'd bled for. His reason? Humility. He said it with a patronizing smile, believing he was teaching me a valuable lesson. What he didn't count on was his emergency triple bypass surgery. He certainly didn't count on me using his 6-week medical leave to systematically dismantle his entire power base, using the very playbook he taught me. My revenge didn't start with a bang. It started with a single, perfectly timed email, sent while he was still under anesthesia. Richard Sterling wasn't just my boss. He was a Wall Street institution. The man whose name was literally on the building. For 15 years, I was his shadow, his protégé. He molded me from a hungry analyst into a ruthless dealmaker. "You're my legacy, Carter," he'd say, clapping me on the back after closing a billion-dollar merger. "Everything I know I'm pouring into you." I believed him. I worked 100-hour weeks, sacrificed relationships, holidays, my entire 20s and 30s, all on the promise of his word. The managing director promotion wasn't just a title, it was the finish line he'd drawn for me, the throne he'd promised. But when the moment came, he didn't just move the goalposts, he burned down the entire stadium. All for a lesson in humility. He wasn't a mentor. He was a king, terrified of his heir. He saw a younger, hungrier version of himself and decided to put me back in my cage. He taught me to be a shark. He just never expected me to start circling his boat while he was bleeding in the water. Our bond was forged in the crucible of the 2008 market crash. I was a junior analyst, practically living under my desk. Richard, already a Wall Street god, found me there at 3 a.m., running models on a failing hedge fund while the world burned. He didn't send me home. He bought me a black coffee, sat down, and for 2 hours, he didn't just teach me finance, he taught me how to hunt. "The herd panics, Carter," he'd said, his voice a low growl. "That's when we feast." For the next 15 years we feasted. I was the tip of his spear. I canceled vacations. I missed my own brother's wedding. I let a woman I might have loved walk away because a deal in Tokyo was more important. It was always more important. All of it was a down payment on a single promise he made 5 years ago. We were at a private table at Per Se celebrating the acquisition of a rival firm, a deal I had single-handedly orchestrated. He raised his glass of Macallan 25. "To Alex Carter," he toasted, his eyes locking onto mine. "The best damn closer in this city. This chair." He gestured vaguely toward downtown, toward our building. "My chair. It's being kept warm for you. You've earned it." That promise was the only thing I could hear the day I walked into his office for the verdict. I saw the leather-bound portfolio on his desk, the one with the promotion announcements. I was practically vibrating. He let me stand there in silence for a full 10 seconds before he finally looked up. "We're giving the managing director role to Peterson," he said, his tone as casual as if ordering lunch. The air left my lungs. "Peterson?" A corporate sycophant who couldn't close a screen door. "Richard, I don't understand. My numbers." He held up a hand, silencing me. "Your numbers are stellar, Alex. Unmatched. But leadership isn't just about numbers. It's about temperament. You're too hungry. You need a lesson in humility." The word hung in the air, thick and insulting. "Humility?" I finally managed, my voice tight. "For 15 years, you taught me to be a killer. You said we feast on the herd. Now you want me to be a sheep?" He smiled then, that placid, infuriating, paternal smile. "I want you to be a shepherd, Alex, not a wolf. This is for your own good. A few more years you'll be ready. You'll thank me for it." I didn't thank him. I walked out of that office, the sound of my own heartbeat like a war drum in my ears. He hadn't seen a protégé who needed a lesson. He'd seen a wolf he could no longer control, and he tried to put me on a leash. He forgot the most important lesson he ever taught me. When you have your opponent cornered, you don't wound them. You finish them. The call about Richard's heart attack came at 5 a.m., 3 weeks after my public execution. His assistant, sounding panicked, told me he was at New York Presbyterian. I felt a surge, not of sympathy, but of pure, unadulterated opportunity. The king had left his castle, undefended. While the surgeons were cracking open his chest, I was drafting an email. It wasn't a get-well-soon card. It was a corporate dagger, sent to the board and every senior partner. The subject line was a masterpiece of cold-blooded strategy, ensuring continuity for the Sterling portfolio. In it, I didn't mention Richard's health. I talked about market volatility and client exposure. I used his own mantra against him. A single point of failure, I wrote, is a terminal diagnosis for any institution. I outlined an interim leadership plan, my plan, to aggressively safeguard our key assets. I wasn't asking for permission. I was informing them of the new reality. By the time anyone could object, I had already seized the helm. My first meeting with Richard's core team was an autopsy. They sat around his mahogany table, looking like frightened disciples who'd lost their Messiah. I didn't offer comfort. I offered clarity. I pulled up the P&L for the last 2 years. Richard is a legend, I said, letting the words hang. But legends get conservative. They protect their legacy instead of building a new one. I went person by person, outlining exactly how Richard's caution had capped their bonuses, stalled their projects, and stifled their careers. I wasn't asking for loyalty. I was offering a hostile takeover of their futures, with them on the winning side. They fell in line before the coffee got cold. Next was Peterson, the newly crowned managing director, the sheep. He'd inherited the Mercer acquisition, a landmark deal Richard had been nursing for a year. I knew the deal's weaknesses because I had designed its strengths. Peterson was presenting his final risk assessment to the board that Friday. I spent 2 nights rerunning my old models, finding the single, fatal flaw Richard had told me to bury, a currency exposure risk that could turn the deal toxic. I didn't warn Peterson. I let him walk into that boardroom and present his flawless, sanitized version. When he finished, basking in the board's approval, I calmly asked one question from the back of the room. Mr. Peterson, could you walk us through your hedging strategy for the yen fluctuation post-election, the one that models a 30% downside? The blood drained from his face. He had no answer. He hadn't even seen the risk. I had just handed him a loaded gun, and he'd fired it into his own career on live television. The final pillar was Richard's clients, especially the Helios Fund, his white whale. Richard managed the relationship with golf trips and $100 cigars. I scheduled a call. I didn't talk about golf. I presented a 40-page analysis proving his conservative strategy was costing them 9 figures a year. Richard built the foundation. I told the fund manager, I'm here to build the skyscraper. By the end of week 3, I wasn't just occupying Richard's office. I was exorcising him from it. I had his desk cleared, his photos removed, his private bar restocked with my preferred bourbon. This wasn't a temporary assignment. It was a demolition. And I was just getting started. The backlash I expected was a tidal wave of outrage. Instead, I got a single, quiet ripple. A one-line email from Jonathan Vance, the firm's other founding partner. The silent, watchful god to Richard's bombastic king. The email read simply, "My office, now." Vance's office was on the 55th floor, a deliberate one-upmanship on Richard's. It was cold steel and glass, a modern cathedral of commerce overlooking Central Park. He sat behind a desk that was completely empty, a stark contrast to Richard's shrine of mahogany and ego. Vance was 75, with eyes that had seen markets born and die. He didn't rise. He just gestured to the single chair opposite him. "The Helios Fund called me this morning," he began, his voice a dry rustle of old money. "They're impressed with your aggressive new direction." He said the words as if they were a foreign species he was examining. I kept my expression neutral. Their portfolio was underperforming. I corrected it. Vance nodded slowly, his gaze unwavering. Richard built that relationship over 20 years of shared brandy and trust. You eviscerated it with a spreadsheet in 20 minutes. He paused, letting the silence stretch. Peterson also called me. He's resigned. Cites a hostile work environment. Peterson was a liability, I stated, my voice flat. He would have sunk the Mercer deal and taken the firm's reputation with it. He was Richard's mistake. And Richard? Vance leaned forward, the movement barely perceptible. Is he a mistake too? This was the test. The real question beneath the polite corporate theater. He's a legend who forgot the most important rule he taught me. I answered, my voice like ice. The market has no memory. It has no loyalty, it only has an appetite. Vance stared at me for a long, silent moment. He wasn't angry, he wasn't shocked. He was simply calculating, the way a man might assess a new, dangerous weapon. Finally, a thin, bloodless smile touched his lips. Richard always said you were his greatest creation, Vance said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. He just never imagined you'd come for your creator. He leaned back, the audience concluded. The board is watching, Alex. They see the numbers. They're excellent numbers. Don't give them a reason to look at anything else. It wasn't an endorsement, it was a warning. I had been weighed, measured, and for now, found profitable. As I stood to leave, he added one final thing, without looking at me. I spoke to Richard's wife. He's out of the ICU. He's asking for you. He's asking for you. The words hung in the sterile air of Vance's office. A summons. Not from a mentor, but from a wounded rival. My phone buzzed. A text from Richard's wife, Eleanor. He's awake, he keeps saying your name. Sympathy was a luxury. Obligation was a chain. I felt neither. I walked past the elevator that could take me to a waiting cab in the hospital. Instead, I returned to the 54th floor. My floor. A king doesn't visit a deposed monarch until the succession is absolute. My coup was effective, but it wasn't yet permanent. I was still operating in a power vacuum. I needed to solidify it, to create a new reality so entrenched that by the time Richard was strong enough to fight back, there would be nothing left to fight for. The Mercer acquisition was the key. It was Richard's legacy project, the final jewel for his crown. Peterson's spectacular failure had left it bleeding out on the boardroom floor. The board was spooked, ready to cut their losses. But I saw what Richard saw, a once-in-a-generation opportunity to corner the European tech market. He just lacked the nerve to execute it properly. His caution, the very humility he wanted to teach me, had turned his masterpiece into a minefield. That minefield was now my kingdom. I called the Mercer deal team into the main conference room at 7 p.m. They were exhausted, defeated. They looked like soldiers who had just watched their general fall. They expected me to kill the deal. We're not killing it, I announced, the words cutting through the stale air. We're renegotiating it, from scratch, tonight. For the next 72 hours we lived in that room, fueled by coffee and the raw, intoxicating energy of a comeback. I ripped Richard's deal apart, piece by piece. His plan was a classic, conservative acquisition: absorb Mercer, fold their people into our divisions, and slowly bleed them of their innovative culture. It was safe. It was profitable. It was archaic. My plan was a revolution. I wasn't just buying a company, I was weaponizing it. I redrafted the entire proposal. We wouldn't absorb Mercer. We would use its acquisition to forge a new, semi-autonomous division, Sterling and Vance Global Technology. A firm within the firm. Faster, leaner, and insulated from the main company's bureaucracy. It would be an incubator for the kind of aggressive, high-risk, high-reward plays Richard had lost the stomach for. And it would be run by a new president of global technology. Me. It was more than a power grab. It was a philosophical schism. I was taking Richard's legacy and surgically carving his name off it, replacing it with a new architecture he couldn't possibly navigate. I scheduled the presentation with the board for Friday morning. I walked them through the currency exposure flaw I'd used to gut Peterson, then showed them my restructured model that turned that very risk into a multi-billion-dollar arbitrage opportunity. I didn't give them a risk assessment. I gave them a manifesto. I showed them projections that made Richard's old numbers look like pocket change. Richard Sterling built this firm to last, I concluded, my voice steady, letting them hear the echo of his own name. But survival isn't the same as victory. This move ensures we do more than just survive the next decade. It ensures we own it. Silence. Then Vance, sitting at the head of the table, his face an unreadable mask, gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. "The motion carries," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. The vote was unanimous. They hadn't just approved a deal. They had approved my coronation. I hadn't just taken Richard's chair. I had melted down his throne and forged a new one. With the signed board resolution saved on my phone, I finally left the office. The car ride to New York Presbyterian was quiet. The city lights blurred into streaks of gold and red. For 15 years, every move I made was to earn Richard's approval. Now I was going to see him armed with the one thing he truly respected, an undeniable victory he couldn't have achieved himself. I found his room in the cardiac wing. Eleanor stood outside, her face a mask of exhaustion and strained politeness. She looked at me, her eyes searching for a flicker of the loyal protégé her husband adored. She found nothing. "He's weak, Alex," she whispered. "Don't upset him." I nodded, the gesture meaningless. Upsetting him was the entire point. I walked past her and pushed open the door. The room smelled of antiseptic and mortality. And there he was. The Wall Street titan, the kingmaker, looked small and frail, lost in a sea of white sheets and blinking machines. Wires snaked from his chest, tracking the rhythm of a heart I had helped break. His eyes fluttered open, and they found me instantly. A flicker of something. Relief? Fear? Crossed his face. His voice was a dry, papery rasp. "Carter," he breathed. "They told me you were keeping my seat warm." I walked to the foot of his bed, not the side. I wanted him to have to look up at me. I held up my phone, the screen glowing with the board resolution, with the announcement of the new Global Technology Division and its president. "I'm not keeping it warm, Richard," I said, my voice calm and clear. "I'm reupholstering it." I let him read the title under my name. "You taught me to be a killer, but you only taught me how to hunt for the firm. You never taught me how to hunt for myself. So I learned. This is the lesson. Thank you, mentor." The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor quickened. Richard stared at the phone, then at me. The color drained from his face, leaving behind a pale, waxy mask. I expected rage. A scream. A final, defiant roar from the lion I had caged. Instead, I got a whisper, so faint I had to lean in to hear it over the machinery keeping him alive. "My legacy," he rasped, his eyes locking onto mine, not with hatred, but with a dawning, soul-crushing horror. "I was building my legacy, and you're tearing it down to sell the bricks." He didn't understand. I hadn't torn it down. I had repurposed the foundation to build something bigger, something he was no longer capable of imagining. He closed his eyes, a single tear tracing a path through the papery skin of his temple. The heart monitor steadied into a rhythm of exhausted defeat. The king was dead. I had just shown his ghost the New World Order. I turned and walked out of the room without another word, leaving him alone with the blinking lights and the ruin of his reign. The next 5 weeks were a blur of bloodless executions. I wasn't just managing Richard's portfolio, I was eradicating his philosophy. His conservative, relationship-based approach was a relic. I implemented a proprietary algorithm I'd been developing for years, a system that traded on statistical probabilities, not gut feelings and golf course handshakes. The market was a machine, and I was finally in the driver's seat. I promoted a new generation of traders, hungry quants, and data scientists who saw Richard Sterling as a historical footnote and me as a liberator. We cut deadweight projects, restructured entire departments, and poached top talent from rivals who were still operating in the 20th century. The numbers were staggering. Profits were up 30%. The board, who once revered Richard, now only revered the bottom line. Vance sent me a single bottle of Macallan 25, the same vintage Richard had toasted me with no note. None was needed. The day Richard returned, the 54th floor was quiet as a tomb. The air was thick with the anticipation of a final, bloody showdown. His assistant had cleared his calendar for the entire day. Everyone was waiting for him to summon me to stage a public execution in the main boardroom. But he didn't. At 11 a.m., he simply appeared in the doorway of his office. He looked restored. Thinner, yes, and the ordeal had carved new lines around his eyes, but the frailty from the hospital was gone. He wore a perfectly tailored suit, a steel gray tie, and an expression I couldn't quite read. It wasn't anger, it was something colder. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "The office looks different," he said, his voice level. He ran a hand over the polished granite of the new desk. "Less personal." "The numbers look different too," I replied, not bothering to stand. "They're better." He walked to the window, staring down at the city he'd once owned. "I built this firm on 25 years of relationships, Alex. On trust. Men trusted me with their fortunes. And I'm making those fortunes bigger," I countered. "You built this firm on winning, I'm just winning more efficiently." "You taught me to feast, Richard. You just got angry when I developed a bigger appetite than you." He turned from the window, and for the first time, I saw the true lesson he'd intended for me. It wasn't about humility, it was about fear. "I saw you becoming me," he said, his voice low and intense. "The same hunger, the same ambition that burns everything it touches. I thought if I held you back, I could temper it. I could save you from it." "You weren't trying to save me," I said, the truth of it landing like a punch. "You were trying to stop me. You're not a king who fears for his heir. You're a god who fears his own creation." A slow, sad smile touched his lips. "Perhaps." He walked back towards the door, his movements calm and deliberate. He paused with his hand on the handle. "You're right, Alex. You're smarter than I was. Faster. More ruthless. You've won. You have the chair, the title, the numbers. But there was one final lesson I never taught you." He opened the door, ready to leave. "You learned how to take a kingdom," he said, looking back at me, his eyes filled with a terrible, patient fire. "But you never learned how to defend it from the man who holds the original deed." He gave me a final, chilling nod. "I'm invoking my founder's clause. I'm calling a partners meeting for tomorrow morning to dissolve my 51% stake and liquidate my holdings. Let's see how much your skyscraper is worth when I pull out the entire foundation." The door clicked shut, leaving a silence more profound than any shouting match. Richard's threat wasn't a negotiation tactic. It was a suicide bomb. He would crater his life's work just to see me buried in the rubble. He thought he was destroying my skyscraper. He was just giving me a cleared lot and a mountain of cash to build a city. For the first time since this began, I felt a flicker of something close to pity. He had nothing left to fight with but the past, and the past doesn't vote. The partners' meeting was awake. Richard stood at the head of the table, a grim executioner, detailing the terms of the firm's dissolution. He spoke of his legacy, his duty, his heartbreak. Every eye in the room darted between us, watching the final act. When he finished, his gaze locked on me, a king demanding supplication from the traitor at his gates. I didn't rise. I simply leaned forward and placed a single, slim portfolio on the table. "I agree," I said, my voice cutting through the funereal silence. "Richard is right. The era of Sterling and Vance is over. It's time for something new." I nodded to Vance, who gave a nearly imperceptible signal. A new slide appeared on the screen behind Richard. It wasn't our logo, it was a sleek, minimalist C. Carter Capital. This morning, I continued, my voice calm, Vance and I, representing the 49% you no longer control, formed a new entity. We have already secured commitments from Helios and our other top 10 clients. We've extended offers to every person in this room and to our top 100 performers. We will be acquiring the firm's core assets, the trading algorithms, the infrastructure, the Mercer deal, during the liquidation. At a significant discount, of course. I finally stood up and looked at Richard. So thank you for your generous severance package. You taught me that the herd panics during a fire sale. You just never thought you'd be the one selling. He stared at the screen, then at Vance, then at me. The fire in his eyes died, replaced by the hollow, vacant look of a ghost. He hadn't pulled out the foundation. He had just signed the deed over to his creation and paid for the demolition himself. The king wasn't just dead. He had just financed the coronation of his successor. So I have to ask, who do you think was more in the wrong here? The mentor who blocked my promotion to teach a lesson, or me for taking his job when I saw the opportunity?